So guys, TNA Wrestling decided to put Mickie James into the Hall of Fame. And I do want to talk a little about this. First of all, I do want to say congratulations to Mickie James. And I really feel that she does deserve this. And if I'm correct, I don't believe she was in the WWE Hall of Fame. And then the other thing about this is that I want to talk a little bit about Mickie James' career. That, when she was first in, I think what happened was with her, she was in TNA Wrestling first for a little while. Then she went to WWE, and then she went back to TNA Wrestling, and she switched around a little bit, and then then she kind of finished up her career in TNA Wrestling, really. But I remember, when she was in WWE, she was kind of the eye candy stuff. There were always, these segments, too, whenever she wrestled. A lot of, the camera shots would be showing in between her legs and stuff like that, just because, that was kind of the Attitude Era. That was just kind of WWE doing that stuff because, that was when, they were into that really sexual objectification of women and stuff like that. Let's call it for what it was, really. But the other thing with WWE is that, she was a champion for a while, and then there was a segment where they turned her to Mickie James, and they made fun of her weight gain, and they kind of turned her into a bit of a joke wrestler and other things like that. But obviously, too, trying to make her be okay, you're gaining a little bit of weight, you're a pig or whatever. I know some people play into jokes about themselves, and there's some people who are cool with it, and then there's sometimes when is it really does it really hurt their feelings, or are they going with it? And then also, what message does that send really to your audience when WWE has turned into a family-friendly company? They're making some fun of somebody's weight, or you look at the history of WWE, they have a very, very objectifying and very sexist looked at women in their history and stuff. Yes, things are different because attitudes have changed. It's the world's become more politically correct than it was in the early 2000s and before then. But the other part of it is that she went to TNA Wrestling, and definitely, in my opinion, she was treated very well there. So you kind of go into that type of thing too, when somebody's part of a company and they don't receive the best treatment, or there may be a diminishing treatment. For example, you look at Eugene, and I believe he was in the NWA or in other promotions. But in WWE, what happened was he played a mentally challenged character, and then he got bullied backstage, and a lot of people were making fun of his, thinking that he was actually mentally retarded. And then also, too, another great example is a lot of black wrestlers. Bobby Lashley was he was never a WWE champion until maybe a few years ago. The Hurt Syndicate, they did a really great job in TNA Wrestling. They got a lot of booking. It really just drew the crowd, really. But in WWE, they dropped the ball on that. Or you look at the Hardy Boys, that when they came back to WWE, they got a loud reception. And when they went to and then after a while, they fizzled out because they didn't really build that momentum. And then when they went to AEW, same thing, really. So TNA Wrestling has kind of been an environment for a lot of wrestlers who have a lot to give. They draw a lot of money, and maybe Tony Khan doesn't know how to use them. And that could also be true with the Vince McMahon era and the now the Triple H era and stuff like that. So Mickie James was one of those wrestlers that said, hey, you know what? I can go to another company. I can be a draw. I can help build a division, because also with divisions, you need stars, really. For example, in AEW, what made MJF was CM Punk and Chris Jericho and Jon Moxley and Bryan Danielson, because, it took them in matches with them to just say, hey, what is this, what is this, MJF guy, really. And with Mickie James, I'm very sure that her having matches with a lot of different women, elevated them as well, really, because she was a draw, really. I think another great example is, Kurt Angle. When Kurt Angle went to TNA Wrestling, that helped Samoa Joe stand out. That helped AJ Styles stand out with all the matches that they had, really. One of the reasons why AJ Styles is so well known is because, he had a retirement match with Dusty Rhodes. He also was part of the Macho Man Randy Savage retirement match. He had a lot of matches with Rob Van Dam and other wrestlers. So when wrestlers go to other companies, in all divisions, the men's division, the women's division, it helps the other stars of those companies stand out, really. As I said, when you think of classic TNA wrestling. You think of Mickie James, you think of ODB, you think of the Beautiful People, you think of and the list goes on and on. Really, I'm trying to Gail Kim is a great example. Awesome Kong, and there's just many other ones as well. Really, but also Mickie James is in that. So definitely her presence has really helped out. And then there's also some controversy. I believe like when she was first in TNA wrestling, I think she was with Raven or whatever, and there was a segment where she got hit by a fireball. And then, if I remember correctly, because I remember reading that on Wikipedia like over 10 years ago, so I can't fact check this, but I know like there was also controversy around her because there was a segment where James Storm was trying to start a cult. I think it was called the Revolution or something like that. But what he did was that there was surveillance footage of him pushing Mickie James on train tracks, and there was a few things about it. I think they said that she was pregnant at that time, or maybe it was a storyline that she was pregnant, but it did start a large controversy because it kind of went down to man on woman violence in professional wrestling, but also too the other thing too that we see in professional wrestling, like when you do an angle where you do something that can nearly kill somebody, how are they actually on the show next week really? Like I think like a lot of people talk about like with AEW, if you do something like Jungle Boy Jack Perry being hit by a flamethrower, and then how do you do it? Maybe like later on in the match, he's winning the match actually against Darby Allin, who's holding a flamethrower. How does that happen really? Where's the logic in that? Or you do something like, when Abyss got hit by Janice, the spike 2x4, and then a few weeks later, he's like fresh like a daisy really. How do you have Mickie James fall onto train tracks? And it's kind of implied that she's either badly injured or I think they even showed footage of a train going over her. How do you kind of survive that, So there was that kind of controversy because of man-woman violence, but also that was kind of when TNA wrestling was kind of diminishing, and they had to do things for attention, really. So they did some shock value stuff. But, because like the history of TNA wrestling was that the golden era was like the early 2000s, and then they got purchased by Dixie Carter, and that was kind of like the mid-era. And then when they went to Hulk Hogan, that was kind of like, the last era of classic TNA really. And then after that, they struggled for many years, and right now it's kind of like I think it's called they're purchased by a different company really. It's not Owl or whatever really, but they got purchased by a different company, and then they had Scott D'Amore, if I'm correct, then Carlos now. So Mickie James was definitely in many parts of that era, really, but she was definitely towards maybe like the end of like the Hogan era, if I remember correctly, and she was definitely in the early part. And I believe she was also part of when they were struggling after they got taken after Hogan and Dixie fucked it up, really. But promise me, Carlos, this promise me you do not put Dixie Carter in the Hall of Fame, because that bitch fucked up TNA wrestling more than more than a Taiwanese hooker and stuff like that, or more than a Bangkok hooker, and all that stuff. Really, so hopefully she doesn't go in the Hall of Fame. I'd rather see Jim Cornette in the Hall of Fame, because that would be hilarious. But the thing about it is too that Mickie James has done a lot for professional wrestling. Yes, she's definitely gotten crapped on by WWE really, and I do feel that it's good that she had a career in TNA wrestling. It's good that she's well respected in TNA wrestling. And it's also good that TNA wrestling exists, because it is an example of people going from other companies into another company and becoming very successful, really. And sometimes we think about just Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Undertaker and a couple of other people that started in other companies and they became big deals in WWF. But there are people like Sting, who, definitely, he went from WCW to TNA wrestling, and that really helped his career. Or AJ Styles, he was in WWE and WCW, if I'm correct, and then he went to TNA wrestling and became a big star. Or, you even look at people like Bobby Lashley, he stood out, he won championships, he won like the heavyweight title of TNA wrestling, like the most important title in the company in TNA, before he became the WWE champion. So definitely it's good that TNA has kind of proven, and that's one reason why she should go down in the Hall of Fame, to say, hey, there are careers, there are championships, there's better usage for you outside of you know, going back to WWE. Maybe they give it right the second time, or betting money on TNA wrestling, or betting money on AEW or New Japan or Ring of Honor, really. So definitely that's really, really helpful and stuff like that. And also too, it's good to kind of see the fact that when she's in WWE, you know, you had Mickie James, you know, mean girl, bullying women, objectifying women's bodies, and then also too, like in WWE, she kind of was like the girl that wore short skirts, and they were always filming up her, you know, dress, trying to film like her, you know, like rolling around between her legs when she was in her underwear, or when she had trunks on or whatever, really. And then when she was in TNA wrestling, she's kind of like, you know, hardcore country. And, you know, she's kind of in the Daisy Dukes and other things like that, where there is sex appeal, but there isn't just, okay, well, please wear a skirt so we can film up your dress, really. We can film whatever's, like, you know, whatever's legal enough, you know, whatever crosses the boundaries between legal and not legal. So it's good that, you know, she had a less, like, sexist, less objectifying depiction of her. And sometimes that happens with companies where you go from being objectified or racial stuff to going to other companies and they treat you better, really, you know. So she's an example of all that. So congratulations, you know, Mickie James. Unfortunately, my dumbass brother drank all the Coors, drank all the Pabst Blue Ribbon, but I want to do, like, you know, a toast to hardcore country. Congratulations, and I'll be there at the arena in Boston. You know, it's in fucking, I live in New Haven. Why the fuck not go to Boston and see some hardcore country, see some beautiful people. Hopefully we see a phenomenal one, and hopefully, you know, Mike Santana whoops that trick, really, you know. So I look forward to my weekend seeing TNA Bound for Glory and see how they do it.